I make a lot of videos which I don't end up uploading, and I just realized that perhaps I haven't given a good summary of a philosophical contradistinction to the social justice framework of reality in life and concepts like racism. So I thought that this might be a restatement of some other video that I posted, but just to simplistically focus on the philosophical treatment of certain issues. So, let's say the non-racialist mind frame is that racism is a symptom of racialism. And so racism is just a kind of subset of actualized racialism at work. Now, because the social justice movement is philosophically premised in racialism, because that is its, it essentially believes that race and culture are real, are in fact the only real entities in some way, that you can only have a kind of real meaning and kind of thoughtful expression of shared value through that conduit, through that vehicle of racialism. Now, because that is their point of departure, that's where they start, that's where they begin from. You can't get anywhere without falling into some form of racism. And so they have to add a separate filter of belief, let's just say, which is that they will profess, therefore, that equality of outcome is the mark of a society which does not have a kind of unjust privilege that's at work. So, and this becomes a kind of these things become conflated and synonymous with each other. So if you don't have an equality of outcome, it's because privilege is doing it. And if you have privilege in a system, and then obviously that makes it absolutely impossible for, let's say, the justice of true sympathy to shame the perpetrator into giving up their usurpation and destruction of their evil privilege, so it's like a marker of so you can, these things are used in the social justice framework to be synonymous with each other, so that the one equals the other automatically. And that happens because there's a they don't So there's an indistinguishable two lines of argument, as it were. The one is that from this racialism is this secondary line of the expectation of an equality of outcome. And the lack of the equality of outcome means that there's some untoward racism happening between the essentially equal groups that are different, but that are essentially should be equal, and that the only reason why they aren't is because there's systemic racism afoot in the system. And so it becomes too easy for people to feel sophisticated at debunking the system and pulling the rug under any kind of actual discussion of policy. All of that gets trumped because you can just say, well, you're not helping attack and tackle head on the lack of equality of outcome. That equality of outcome becomes the kind of the liberal shortcut, right? Even though it really I mean, it quite disgustingly destroys liberal values. So, I mean, to call it anything to do with liberalism is kind of really quite insane. And the only reason why they need the equality of outcome, they have to have the principle of equality of outcome, because it is the only principle that can save them from being racist, because they come from a racialist premise. So a lot of people don't even understand, let's say, the philosophical dimension of how there's a racial essentialism at the core of this thinking. There's a kind of hypocritical racism right at the foundation. But they love let's say, the liberal shortcut of being able to just simply go for the jugular and say, look, if there's not equality of outcome, there's something wrong happening. And I mean, technically, on some level, you could say, yes, maybe. I mean, because, people make choices at the end of the day, and, people can decide to have a difference of outcome, essentially. But in as much as that is obscured, that you cannot see the correlation between the decision and the outcome, then you can say, well, there are problems, there are issues that need to be tackled and faced. But you see, there's a difference in style of policy and style of ideological resolution to these things, where the social justice person wants to directly compensate the victim and fix the situation in that kind of direct way. Whereas if you have any kind of liberal values, you understand that kind of interventionism is going to be incredibly disruptive, and it's not even necessarily going to be authentic or sustainable. And in fact, it never is. That if you're not doing it authentically, you're not doing the hard, slow work of building it from the ground up. You can't just give the shortcut of, let's just pretend that we can redistribute something, and that it should follow that reality and sort of standards will just kind of collapse around this blunt rearrangement. So there's this kind of idea that you can legitimize destructive integration, essentially, that you can sort of destructively force your will and directly compensate the victim, instead of actually working out how to rehabilitate the facts on the ground and the reality on the ground. Instead of that kind of hard question of actually trying to bridge things, you can just go straight for the shortcut of just do it already, somehow, some way, and afterwards we'll call it, we'll label it as legitimate, and no one is allowed to have any kind of opinion about it, because the only people who can talk about things are people talking amongst themselves within their in-group. There's no such thing as communication between groups. There's only in-group values and meaning. And if you trespass on other people's internal sense of there's no question that can penetrate between groups and that can force another group to substantiate their reasoning. That is the definition of racism in this paradigm of cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation is really one of the means by which you set up the separate but equal racialist paradigm. And so it seems to give this very powerful tool of what is essentially false transformation to people, because all they have to do is find out who is standing in the way of the equality of outcome. And if you are in some way complaining about the dispensation of a direct compensation that's going to bring about the equality of outcome, then you are the evil bastion of privilege standing in the way. And so there's this whole conflation that that privilege is defined as this kind of stark evil, and there is no sensitivity towards building a bridge to that privileged position, or that privileged. So there's this kind of moral entity that is created in this kind of pure black and white narrative of knowing that it is evil, and that the destruction of evil must therefore be good. And so you've got this kind of very formulaic, emotional, moral claim that everyone can very easily get hysterical over. You can generate this mass hysteria that we just need justice towards this very simple oversimplification of reducing reality into essentially a false dilemma. And so, this sort of lashing out in terms of needing a quality of outcome right away comes from the ideological necessity that without the principle of building a quality of outcome, the social justice movement itself would have to regard itself as utterly racist. So the only way to start your philosophical framework on the basis of stark racialism, because it's on the ground floor. They believe that races are essentially different entities in terms of their truth value, that they can only have a truth value inside their own groups and inside their own in-group cultures, And so because they believe that in that kind of separate but equal paradigm, they have to demand a quality of outcome, because that is the only way in which you can have any kind of integrated society, or any kind of proof that the ideology works without it devolving into utter fascistic racism. So they're kind of priding themselves by being so intrinsically racist but not being fascist. So they're it's a badge of honor that they believe in racism at a fundamental level, but that because they believe in a quality of outcome, they are defeating that evil inclination that is at the core of their belief system. So there is a kind of cognitive dissonance right at the ground floor. And so this is why they are so frantic about pushing for equality of outcome, because it's the only way that they can vindicate that they are not racists themselves, even though I would just call this hypocritical racism. That they are essentially, and this is why this kind of mentality was called by Hitler the useful idiot mentality. This is why, because it spreads the fascistic conception of society. It tells people how to be, because essentially the more you push for equality of outcome, that is virtually the same argument for racial essentialism. Every time you push for equality of outcome, it's reaffirming the implicit racialist premise, and it's making it a larger concern. Implicitly, it's making it a cultural thing. It's making it a very powerful cultural button that some tyrant can come and pull that lever and push that button and let it loose. And this is the thing, is that even if you have a fascist takeover, even if they completely win, and this is, it becomes the political orthodoxy of the day, it completely controls the political establishment, even if they completely win, they still need to find an excuse to pull that lever and push that button. You have to keep on creating an enemy. You have to because it's the only way to actualize the kind of the value system. Because you can only channel that identity when you have privilege to fight against. So you can only define your integrated value system that you share with your in-group racial essentialism when you've got something that's threatening it, when you've got a scapegoat, to counteract, and so you have to set up a boogeyman, and you have to keep on reinventing it, and this comes out very clearly in Nazi Germany when they had when they were winning the war. The propaganda was at its height. They had already reinvented the conspiracies against them multiple times, having to recreate the same waves that you are experiencing in South African society when you listen to the radio and you listen to the news and you listen to these very manufactured journalistic, sort of that's all feeding into this, this identity politics. Paradigm of justice for the identity, and why don't we have an equality of outcome? All this propaganda around the equality of outcome, which is setting up this kind of this racial essentialism that has to find some kind of political manifestation at some point, and so. That doesn't go away. That never goes away. Even if you have a genocide, it doesn't go away. You have to somehow, for the society to sustain itself, it can't ever drop it. And then, the political society is so weak because, to keep up this level of propaganda is, it's like keeping a society in constant adrenaline. And so, and the people in power feel very paranoid that someone's going to, people tried to kill Hitler many times from within the establishment. Many people hated the Nazis, although they had to kind of go along with it, because when you have 20% of the population that has bought into this ideological bullshit, 20% of any population that's on the same page, it's very hard to get around that, and then you've got a militarized police force, you've got propaganda police, it's too late. They control things, when they reach a kind of cultural mass, it's going to happen. There's going to be a coup. They're going to burn down the parliament. They're going to do something to engineer it, and you can. I really see so many manufactured narratives, and just the public radio. It's this well-oiled machine ventilating these waves of hyperrealism around and cooking up this mass hysteria over equality of outcome, all the while. There's no need to substantiate a case any further than just saying, well, there's not an equality of outcome, therefore privilege is what needs to be deconstructed and removed from the system, and then you won't have the equality of outcome. Then you won't have the inequality of outcome. And so that is what I always term as the kind of the false dilemma that they can sort of pose, that they can say, no, this is the thing that must be directly tackled. This is the obstacle and the hurdle to be overcome. Is that you must destroy privilege, or you must destroy the inequality of outcome. That those are the only two options to fixing the situation. And it definitely doesn't fix the situation. In fact, it always makes the situation worse, because when the racialism underpinning it is the kind of the framework with which you identify the different groups, and they're not allowed to mix. They're not allowed to have their lines blurred. They're not allowed to change and look like one another. They're not allowed to learn from one another. So there's this very strange kind of selective historical hypocrisy and relativism that certain things that are shared somehow belong to everything and everyone in the system, and other things are privilege, and we must just delineate what is privilege and what was just like everyone's natural birthright, instead of saying the whole situation is a mixed inheritance, and the only thing that's important is tackling the problems as they exist in the present and not as they are historically defined. That historically defining the problem does nothing to presently defining the solution. That those two things are not going to be symmetrical, because if they were, then you are applying no creativity into the present. You are applying no transformative synthesis. You are not looking for tangible opportunity. You're only looking for some kind of revenge-based retributivism, which obviously has nothing to do, that kind of model of destructive integration really just has to do with emotional logic of, let's have a tit for tat, and let's, just kind of, and essentially, because identity politics is always in that mode of retributivism, it eventually destabilizes liberal values to the point at which people will eventually have to give up and say, no, we just need to go our separate ways. We need to set up borders between the different groups. We need to find a way to avoid each other. We need to find a way not to influence one another in a kind of stable way. And so then you get the kind of the true manifestation of the internal philosophical setup of the racial essentialism finally blooms, and people realize that they were actually ethno-fascists from the start. That it's just that their principles could only be carried out in the final analysis on the level of ethno-national fascistic politics, So, eventually the useful idiots will kind of say, oh, well, we relent. We just need strong demagogues and tyrants to create a strong state. So, because, without a strong authoritarian institutional power that can basically disregard liberal values, and so it can dispense that retributivistic bloodthirst for revenge, because that's essentially how social justice is measured, is how much privilege are you destroying. It's got nothing, it doesn't have a mind to see a kind of a positive progress. It can only see progress in the negative term of deconstructing privilege and equalizing the outcomes. And so it requires a kind of direct compensation and a direct intervention, which will always be at the expense of universal standards and liberal values, and a kind of an equality. It will always be at the expense of the equality of opportunity. And so because it doesn't like policy that actually, in fact, it will destroy policy, or it will detract against policy that tries to improve access. It will say, no, we don't want access, we want compensation directly. Don't try to grow access. Don't try to sustainably build a system in which there's a bridge between, capability and ability. Like, don't try to build up our ability. Don't try to improve access to anything. We want it directly delivered to us because we deserve it. And so, because that can only happen at the expense of the system at large, you need to have a tyrant that has control over the system at large to say, I'm going to be the representative for the justice of the identity which is lacking in this system. And so the system becomes a kind of moral domain, which can only work politically as a kind of authoritarian system. So this is why you need to have a kind of, and this is why, these things happened at universities where you have, kangaroo courts set up and you have internal procedures, which are the kind of the most disgusting, set of legal positivism, which, if it were properly reviewed within the current, let's say the jurisprudence of South Africa is at, substantively, it's at an incredibly good level. And I would say that the only reason why we haven't gone fully fascist yet is because the judiciary kind of expects the morality, the seat of morality, to live in the individual and not in these kinds of mob justice of the group, that it belongs to this kind of fictional, cultural, ethnic animal that everyone is just a kind of a hive insect within, and that you can only, so for that kind of equality of outcome to even be measured, you are forced to statistically lay everyone into a kind of this is an example that came to me, although it's quite a big tangent and it's to do with science, I guess. But the scientific paradigm, which I think it offered the kind of the fake authority which has been modeled by the social justice people, because I mean, like, science itself is it pretends to have a state of knowledge. It pretends to be a field of knowledge, which it really isn't. This is a horrible tangent, but you can see that there is no complete knowledge in science about reality. It is an approximation of knowledge, but it is not a knowledge of approximation. And that is an important distinction to make. And so you can only ever know and predict the outcome of a process because you can control the conditions to exclude everything which you don't understand to be a deterministic aspect of reality. So science kind of only tracks determinism, and it only tracks aspects of determinism. And so it's got a kind of rule book of collected regularities, which it sees are deterministic features which exist within reality. And it doesn't understand all the features of reality, and there are a lot of features which have nothing to do with determinism. And so it pretends to have a mastery of knowledge about reality because it can just use that knowledge, and that knowledge will seem to succeed if they are successful at controlling for excluding all the features which are non-deterministic, which, to put it bluntly, is impossible to do. You can approximately get good enough at controlling for things that you don't have to worry too much, but it's impossible to do that form of control. And so it can kind of get away with its approximate expertise. So, and then it conflates that approximate expertise with true knowledge of reality, which it doesn't have. So, I mean, it's knowledge about what can technically be achieved within certain conditions of which are not fully understood, but if they can be engineered to be present at a particular endeavor of like an actual real life thing that is set up. So there's this tremendous weight that's given to features which are deterministic, and that's just because our philosophical knowledge over these sorts of issues in science is very backwards, to say the least. I mean, scientists are incredibly bad philosophers, and in fact, it's hurt the scientific field because it's not able to progress. It's kind of stunted itself because it only knows how to deal with deterministic features, and it has no idea how to change the thinking about scientific methodology in order to incorporate non-deterministic features about reality. So it has to kind of have this strange kind of denial about the non-deterministic nature of reality, and it can kind of get away with this by, approximating a good enough track record of being able to exclude non-deterministic features from actual incidents of so-called scientific exploration and knowledge. And so essentially what I'm saying is there's a piece of low-level knowledge which is nowhere close to the complete picture, and because we're able to kind of put a kind of border around it and say, well, nothing outside of this border interferes too much with what's going inside this border, so we can know that what is in this border is correct. The truth is that that borderline is actually incredibly fuzzy. In fact, it's completely fictional, and it kind of the only way it can get away with that is through a kind of orthodoxy about concepts about materialism itself and concepts about knowledge, and that how knowledge is always reducible to some kind of physical material realism. So there's and so it just kind of operates from a convenient table-thumped premise about almost a kind of semantic sophistry, really. I mean, that's what it usually amounts to, is there'll be a kind of authoritarian claim about how words interrelate and are used to define each other. And this kind of tremendous, convenient and capricious semantic ceiling which gets kind of invoked into situations. This is what happens when you try to get into a kind of philosophical discussion with someone who thinks that science has done anything. I mean, it's sort of anything in the context of epistemology or reality or knowledge. Really, there is no distinction between science and alchemy. It is really that, alchemy and science are really, they're on the same line. They're on the same level of experimentation and thinking, let's just say. In fact, you could even say that science has done a bit worse because it's kind of calcified itself in a particular methodology which it's kind of philosophically incapable of revising and understanding in the context of, the data. And so it's kind of it's created very strange external locuses of control in the realm of epistemology and understanding. That understanding is now kind of within the scientific community generally conceived as a kind of non-human characteristic. This is what they've had to do to square the circle. Anyway, I don't want to harp on too much about that. The reason why I wanted to bring that up primarily is for the practical example of that the only reason why science seems to get away with itself is because it can rely on deterministic regularities and with some successful historical track record be able to control experiments and control physical processes from excluding all the non-deterministic features, which it really doesn't have much knowledge about. And so it kind of it seems it seems to get away with its claim to having any kind of knowledge because it's able to create an unsubstantiated philosophical distinction between determinism and non-determinism. So there's this kind of automatic presumption that deterministic features, which are the only ones that it happens to be able to work with, and which it's not able to even, it doesn't even know how to stop the non-deterministic features from getting into, it can't fully control for those non-deterministic features. And by its very nature, it doesn't understand the non-deterministic features. So it's kind of, it has to define it as a kind of noise. I'm just trying to There are more stark ways of characterizing the same phenomena, but this is essentially the trick of kind of disregarding and insulating your ideology from critique. Is, you have to kind of sell yourself, we're the only game in town. You can't do it any other way. And the biggest claim that the scientists have is you should be grateful to science. Oh, is that what I should be grateful to? That it doesn't sort of it can only do that by a kind of identity thing. Well, science has actually done this service, and the thing that has provided it, it is owed to science. I mean, is it owed to science, or is it owed to the creativity and the innovation and the ingenuity of people working a method, and that method, I would even say, does not by itself generate anything. I mean, in fact, I would even say that the only time you get any kind of practical worth out of science is after you have what I would conceive of as junk science, is when you have a full set of understanding a kind of approximate deterministic level of functionality, which whenever you have such a full set, you always know that it's a kind of level of operation and that it's not the deepest level of explanation, and in fact it's quite an approximate description of functionality that essentially is not a knowledge of approximation, it's approximate knowledge. That's all it is approximate knowledge, and it will only give you right answers as much as you can kind of control for all the things which wouldn't put a wrench into the works of that particular level of approximation, which is actually not a clearly defined and bordered field of knowledge or level of description. It's fuzzy because there's a depth which doesn't have, which is literally it cannot be fathomed by that approximate level. And the conflation with that approximate level as being anything real and being any kind of certain or serious knowledge, which it isn't. I mean, it's practically useful. It's technically useful. You can use something. You can do something with it, perhaps. But the exercise of that use, the utility value of that is going to be highly contextual. And I would even argue that there are lots of arguments that the technical sweetness of the ability to do things is not just because you've created this powerful instrument or tool. It really, there's a greater wisdom about how you use it. I'm just going to allude to the famous examples of nuclear war could be the end of us all. So how technically how useful is the God of science therefore? Okay, I mean, to kind of poetically wrap that up. But, okay, I'm going to... that's quite a serious tangent, I guess. But yeah, I'm focusing on the kind of... the philosophical ineptitude of making... I have said this before in this particular series of recordings, I'm sure, is that the biggest problem that identity politics has is I'm trying to think. I used to summarize this, and I just wanted to get back to that simplistic point again, but I keep on finding deeper avenues of elaboration, but in some sense it sets up a kind of a false economy in terms of a kind of a social market or a social currency of justice, and when people are sort of fixated on that, that zero-sum game of that particular economy of privilege and compensation and racialist pride, or it really has this kind of pervasive illiberal destabilization of just the notion of accountability and responsibility on the level of any sort of independence. And, they're so quick to kind of jump into this kind of defensive, reactive argument of, oh, he's making a bootstrap argument. And I'm not. Government is definitely needs to provide access to those things, needs to help facilitate access to those things. But it is a tricky thing, because if you do it in the wrong way, you are creating a kind of unhealthy codependence. On some level, you cannot make a system or a program that is going to automatically fix the situation, because if it's not something that sustainably taps into cultivating accountability in people and letting them and promoting their active participation, if the program has to succeed no matter what kind of input you get from the participants, it's going to be doomed to failure. You can't have a system that is going to work 100% of the time for 100% of the people. There has to be. It should substantiate itself. It should justify itself in terms of its selective nature if it does manifest as some kind of selective exclusion. But the idea that automatically everyone must succeed is going to already make it a system in which it's going to be impossible for people to actualize responsibility and accountability. So, it's one of those sorts of cart before the horse things, or a catch-22 situation. You have to avoid policies that are going to be prone to a catch-22 situation, because also when you do that, you are automatically going to create some form of opportunity for vast corruption. Whenever you have a policy that is not actively treating the problem, but is instead trying to create a stable guarantee and a stable security that makes sense to some kind of crazy, moralistic, absolute ideology, it will always, by definition, there will be a way to milk the system in a sense, because in a sense you can incentivize bad actors. By definition, you will be incentivizing bad actors. So the point is to find interventions which are promoting ability and are doing so in a way that doesn't have some kind of indirect toxic disintegrating effect on the integrity of a system, and essentially what you generally want to do is promote and incentivize the involvement of a system that bridges itself, but there has been no interest in developing that bridge. Generally people have wanted to create policies which are prone to mismanagement so that you can get basically corruption. There's kind of been a wholesale aggregation of power towards a stronger centralized regulatory framework that's going to simulate a kind of social justice direct compensation delivery device, and when the system at large is not happy to kind of filter reality so as to agree with that intention of kind of gerrymandering and rigging the system in a kind of direct racial compensatory, what I've described as a destructive integration. Even opening your eyes and seeing that it's a destructive integration and how it essentially makes it impossible for authentic job creation to happen and how it's impossible for authentic and genuine growth to take place. So, I mean, who knows what South Africa would have been like if we had a growth rate of 5%. In the years in which, I mean, yes, these things are also held hostage to international financial trends and such. But if we actually had a pro-business, I mean, small businesses generally fare better, and if we had a strong small business section of the economy, I mean, you get a kind of exponential growth return from that over time, because of the kind of the skills incubation facility. I mean, it is the third leg of every economy. You can't have a table with just two legs. Without small business, you're not even pretending to give freedom a chance. You're not even pretending to kind of get people into a position in which they can develop skills and have access to skills, which promotes a kind of liberal and libertarian self-sustaining responsibility. Instead, we've gone for this model of this kind of endless infantilism and government being the good guy, and everyone must just kind of line up to get some kind of benefit or redistribution from the government, and then there's these big corporations. And the big corporations are not the problem. The problem is that with the toxic labor market, it's just made small business practically an endangered species in South Africa. I mean, it's just a non-starter. It's been ruled out by government, essentially. I mean, yes, they will. I'm not saying that there are no small businesses, but what I'm saying is that it's insignificant to what there should be and what there could be, but that it's virtually impossible to be a major success. It's I mean, there isn't enough negative press on government for this level of sabotage and this level of kind of ideological toxicity, this kind of politicization of labor on a level at which it's so toxic in every way. I mean, for a country with this much unemployment, it's really is that is the biggest injustice. That is the biggest social injustice that exists in South Africa today. Is government's unwillingness to let the market have a chance at actually developing the country, because it wants to promote some ideological purity about rights, which we have a constitution which is really sophisticated enough to say, yes, these are the rights that we have on paper that we want to get to and that we want to fulfill, but any right can be limited depending on the purpose and the intention of limiting such a right. So yes, we have lots of workers' rights. Well, maybe it's really worth scaling back on that so that we can actually have less unemployment, which is the biggest social injustice. So, there's every tool for a policymaker to fix this country. There really is. But there's no, it would break the ideological mold. It would break the gravy train for corruption and mismanagement. It would remove the simple and easy excuse that government has to just blame history, and blame a particular minority identity group, which you can say, we've got some element in our country that is still functioning and everyone else is not functioning, so they must be the ones to blame. All the while, no one can look at the thin crust of the black elite, making off with, special token stuff, because, if you statistically include those incomes and take out an average, then whites are still doing better. So you don't even perceive actual problems. You don't perceive, where the system is kind of vastly corrupt, because it's just under the headings of these arbitrary factions, which are basically revived by saying, it's everything is racism, and so we have the mandate to be more radical, because the only reason why things aren't doing better is because of racism. And the sad thing is, on some level that's true, but it's the racism of the social justice movement. That is the racism that is causing the problems in this country. It is a subset of the racialism. So it's because non-racialism is something that they didn't want. It's just there are not enough excuses in the non-racialist lexicon. There's no convenient and easy way to find a scapegoat. So they wouldn't go for non-racialism. So they invented identity politics, and now their group is already right, and it's just that there isn't enough blood in the streets to pave the way for retrieving the paradise which was robbed from them by this historical influence which was unjust and should have never been. This is the oversimplified, boiled down narrative which they're running on, which is the fascistic contemplation of retrieving one's racialist pride from excavating history, from excavating the injustice of history. It's such a disgusting diversion that will even stop people from identifying the real source of problems and implementing the real solutions to actual problems. All the while telling people that no, they mustn't try to find the real solutions because they wouldn't even work, because people are essentially different. It has this hypocritical racism right at the core of it. That, like people don't have, and I mean, on some level, that might be true between like men and women. I think that a lot of this might have come from feminism, that because feminism could not find its equality of outcome, it had to double down and create a stronger indictment against the system at large. And so it had to be they had to double down and start including race and gender. And so, I mean, there's obviously there's much more difference between the genders than, there's practically no difference between races. I mean, it's completely negligible. I mean, it's all pretty much down to child rearing and cultural values, and it's all stuff that is pretty fluid. I mean, it might be laid down and set in your early childhood, to some degree. I mean, there's nothing really that's too fixed. It really depends on how skilled people are at kind of bridging gaps and, sort of learning and appropriating things that do occur across culture. I mean, there's a tremendous wealth that you get from opening your eyes to someone who is doing something better, and there is a lot that can be learnt. And in fact, that is for the individual. That's not for groups. That's for individuals to think about as they might wish to. There is essentially nothing about a human which isn't something that you can convert to, like people change religion sometimes. So there's a... and if you lose that conception of humanity, you really have given up your humanity. You've just become a kind of... you belong to your pack. You belong to your breed. You just become a kind of... a fascistic dog. I mean, essentially, I'm not going to repeat that, all those descriptions, although they... and when you've got your thinking locked into that kind of pack mentality, I mean, it's just you belong to the racist cult now. You are no different from any other cult member, essentially, and you become just as essentially stupid. Is you have to be the life of your group as a kind of collective, and so you have to vicariously exert your pride into your environment, and you have to use that as how you communicate to people. It's so disgusting. And so then you get this kind of really disgusting ritual of how people have to size each other up, and there's absolutely no substance available for tangible communication. It's just this kind of strange racialist sympathy between these separate and equal representatives of different groups. It's essentially the vision of apartheid. That is what the social justice movement essentially amounts to. Can't remember if I addressed that point that I wanted to bring up right at the very start. Anyway, I guess it's good enough rant.